the case of Richard Bernard Moore, a firing squad execution and justice reform. Richard Bernard Moore's name has become a focal point in the debate over capital punishment within the United States. Convicted nearly 24 years ago for the murder of a store clerk during a failed robbery, Moore is scheduled to be executed in South Carolina. What sets his case apart is not only the lengthy gap in executions in the state — he would be the first inmate executed in over a decade — but also the method he has chosen: death by firing squad. This decision, along with the circumstances surrounding Moore's crime and trial, raises significant moral, legal, and systemic questions. As true crime enthusiasts, let's delve deep into the complexities of this case, examining both the personal details of the crime and the broader implications for the criminal justice system, especially in light of persistent calls for reform. In September 1999, 35-year-old Richard Bernard Moore entered Nicky's Speedy Mart, a convenience store in Spartanburg, South Carolina. At the time, Moore was struggling with drug addiction, a battle that had spiraled into desperation. His intent that day was to gather money to fund his addiction, but he was unarmed. Inside the store, he encountered James Mahoney, a store clerk. What began as an attempted robbery escalated into tragedy. An altercation ensued after Mahoney, who had a firearm, attempted to defend himself. Moore grabbed the weapon during the struggle, and in the chaos, Mahoney was fatally shot. Moore sustained a gunshot wound himself but managed to flee, taking $1,408 from the store. Though the details are straightforward, a robbery turned deadly, the nuances of Moore's actions raise questions about intent and culpability. His defense argued that he did not enter the store intending to kill, and that he only fired the gun in self-defense during the scuffle. Regardless, the jury found him guilty of armed robbery and murder, sentencing him to death. Moore's case, like many involving capital punishment, has been fraught with legal complexities. His defense team pointed out significant racial and procedural factors that may have influenced the verdict. One of the most pointed critiques was the composition of the jury. There were no African Americans on the panel, despite Spartanburg's diverse population. This lack of representation called into question whether Moore was afforded a fair trial. Additionally, the long delay between Moore's sentence and his scheduled execution illustrates broader systemic challenges. For years, his case lingered in the appeals process, a torturous labyrinth that delays resolution for both the defendant and the victim's family. While appeals serve as a safeguard for justice, they often highlight inefficiencies and inconsistencies in the legal process. Complicating matters further has been a nationwide shortage of drugs typically used for lethal injections. With pharmaceutical companies halting the distribution of these drugs for executions, states like South Carolina have had to find alternative methods. In 2021, the state approved the use of the electric chair and firing squad, placing condemned inmates like Richard Moore in the unsettling position of having to select their method of execution. South Carolina's adoption of the firing squad marks a controversial step in the evolution of execution methods. Though technically legal since 2021, the practice hadn't been utilized, leaving Moore poised to take part in a grim historical milestone. Initially scheduled for execution in 2022, Moore chose the firing squad over other options, such as the electric chair. However, legal challenges to the method delayed the process, leading to the eventual reinstatement of his execution date. The introduction of the firing squad as a sanctioned form of execution raises difficult ethical questions. Historically, it has been used as an alternative under the belief that it is less gruesome or inhumane. But is it truly? Critics argue that legitimizing such practices moves society backward, embracing methods that feel archaic and brutal. While Richard Moore's actions on that fateful night in 1999 cannot be excused, they also cannot be fully disentangled from the socio-economic forces that shaped his life. His early years were marked by economic hardship and an escalating struggle with substance abuse. These factors culminated in his desperate attempt to rob Nicky's Speedy Mart, a choice driven more by addiction than malice. Moore's case is a glaring example of how socioeconomic inequality and drug addiction can intersect with crime, creating situations where punishment eclipses rehabilitation. Instead of addressing the root causes of such behaviors, poverty, addiction, and systemic inequities, the criminal justice system often doubles down on punitive measures. The racial dynamics of this case are equally troubling. The complete absence of African Americans on Moore's jury cannot be ignored. It points to a pattern in the United States where predominantly white juries disproportionately sentence black and brown defendants to death. This trend underscores the racial inequities permeating the justice system, perpetuating cycles of injustice for marginalized populations. The case of Richard Moore reignites debates about the morality and effectiveness of the death penalty. Proponents argue that it serves as a deterrent for violent crimes and brings justice to victims and their families. However, evidence supporting its deterrence effect has been scarce. In fact, many leading criminologists suggest that the death penalty does little to prevent crime and may instead exacerbate societal divisions. Opponents of capital punishment, including reform advocates, posit a more compassionate view of justice. They argue that the death penalty is inherently flawed, applied inconsistently, and prone to error. The reintroduction of firing squads in particular has sparked outrage as critics see it as dehumanizing and out of sync with a modern society striving for fairness and humanity. For true crime enthusiasts, Richard Moore's case offers a chance to delve into the raw complexities of the justice system. Beyond the salacious details of his crime lies a far more concerning narrative, one of procedural failings, racial bias, and the unresolved question of what justice truly means. Cases like Moore's illustrate both the human fallibility that influences judicial decisions and the slow wheels of bureaucracy that grind down defendants for decades. As consumers of true crime content, we bear a certain responsibility to look beyond the spectacle and examine the systemic issues that bring cases like Moore's to national attention. His story invites us to ask difficult questions. Are executions, particularly by methods like firing squads, ever humane? What role should societal factors such as addiction or economic struggle play in sentencing decisions? And most importantly, can a justice system that disproportionately penalizes minorities ever be truly just? Richard Moore's pending execution represents more than the end of a legal saga. It serves as a clarion call for reform. Activists argue that his story highlights precisely why the death penalty must be reevaluated. From the racial bias evident in his trial to the state's decision to embrace firing squads, it becomes clear that capital punishment often fails to embody fairness or proportionality. Reform advocates propose alternatives focusing on rehabilitation over retribution. Investments in mental health resources, drug rehabilitation programs, and education could reduce the likelihood of crimes like Moore's while addressing the systemic neglect that often pushes individuals towards such desperate actions. Instead of sentencing Moore to die for his crime, the justice system might have chosen to examine his addiction and offer solutions that promote accountability and growth. The case of Richard Bernard Moore epitomizes the tensions at the heart of capital punishment debates. On the one hand, there is an undeniable need to uphold the rule of law and provide closure to victims' families. James Mahoney's tragic death is a painful reminder of the human cost of crime, and his family deserves justice. Yet, justice should not be confused with retribution. Moore's case raises essential questions about the true purpose of punishment. Is the justice system meant to avenge, or should it strive to create opportunities for change? As his execution date looms, it forces us to confront the morality of taking a human life in the name of the state. Ultimately, Richard Moore's story remains an unsettling reminder of the imperfections in our justice system. For true crime enthusiasts, it is a case worth studying, not just for the grim details of the crime, but for the broader reflection it demands on how we define and administer justice. As a society, we must decide whether we value fairness and reform or choose to preserve a punitive system that often fails the very people it claims to protect. While Moore's name may fade from headlines, the deeper implications of his case will continue to resonate, urging us to consider the possibility of systemic change.